There is a reason America has not built a new primary aluminum smelter since 1980. It is not because Americans forgot how to make aluminum. It is because making aluminum from raw materials requires enormous amounts of electricity, involves significant environmental risks, and has become increasingly difficult to justify economically when other countries can produce the same metal at lower cost. Now Oklahoma is being asked to host the first new American smelter in nearly half a century. Its supporters promise jobs, economic development, and greater national security. Those benefits deserve consideration. But before Oklahoma commits its land, electricity, public money, and environmental resources, taxpayers and nearby residents deserve a complete accounting of what this project would cost, and who would bear those costs. I live close enough to the proposed Inola facility that this is not an abstract debate about industrial policy. The people celebrating a manufacturing announcement in Washington will not be the ones living near the plant, driving behind additional freight traffic, worrying about emissions settling on nearby farmland, or paying Oklahoma electric bills. We will. Primary aluminum production begins with bauxite or mined in other parts of the world. The bauxite is refined into alumina. The alumina is then processed through an electricity-intensive smelting operation to produce aluminum. That distinction matters. The proposed Inola facility would not make Oklahoma independent of foreign raw materials. Unless additional facilities were built elsewhere in the supply chain, the smelter would still depend on alumina produced from bauxite that must be mined and refined before it arrives in Oklahoma. What Oklahoma would provide is the industrial site, the workforce, and a tremendous amount of electricity. Electricity is one of the central reasons aluminum smelters have become difficult to operate economically in the United States. Industry reporting indicates the number of operating American primary smelters has declined to approximately 4. Older facilities closed or reduced production as electricity costs increased and producers shifted toward places with cheaper power. Canada has a competitive advantage because of abundant hydroelectric resources. American manufacturers increasingly relied on imported primary aluminum and domestic recycling, which requires only a fraction of the electricity needed to produce new aluminum from alumina. The absence of new American smelters is not a historical accident. It reflects an economic reality. A tariff can make imported aluminum more expensive, and a subsidy can make a project appear attractive. Neither changes the electricity required to keep a smelter running. Oklahoma Primary Aluminum is a joint venture between Emirates Global Aluminium, which owns 60% of the project, and Century Aluminum, which owns the remaining 40%. The companies propose investing approximately $4 billion to build a facility capable of producing as much as 750,000 metric tons of aluminum annually. Supporters say the project could create approximately 1,000 permanent jobs and support around 4,000 construction jobs. Those are meaningful numbers. Oklahoma needs good-paying employment, and manufacturing can play an important role in economic development. But the project's benefits do not erase its costs. Federal support could reach $500 million, and Oklahoma incentives are estimated at approximately $255 million. Together, that represents roughly $755 million in public support before accounting for possible tax exemptions, infrastructure improvements, power arrangements, or additional costs that have not been fully disclosed. Divided by the approximately 1,000 permanent jobs the project promises, that amounts to roughly $755,000 in direct federal and state support per permanent job. That calculation does not account for construction employment, future tax revenue, or broader economic benefits. But neither does it include every public cost. Before taxpayers are told the project is a bargain, they deserve to see both sides of the ledger. The proposed smelter could require more than 11 terawatt-hours of electricity each year. That is approximately 11 billion kilowatt-hours. Spread across an entire year, it would require an average continuous supply of roughly 1,250 megawatts. According to industry reporting, that is enough electricity to power a major city such as Boston or Nashville for a year. The project developers say their technology would use approximately one-third less electricity per ton of aluminum than other existing American facilities. That may be an improvement, but a more efficient facility can still consume an extraordinary amount of power when it is designed to produce 750,000 metric tons of aluminum annually. Oklahoma Primary Aluminum acknowledges that it is still negotiating a long-term electricity agreement with Public Service Company of Oklahoma. The company also acknowledges that additional grid capacity will be needed. Who will pay for new generation and transmission improvements? Will the smelter receive a discounted industrial rate? And if so, who absorbs the difference? What happens if the plant closes, reduces production, or fails to meet its projections after new infrastructure has been built? Will residential customers or smaller businesses face higher rates because one industrial customer needs the equivalent of a major city's electricity supply? The company says the Oklahoma Corporation Commission will review the agreement. That review matters, but the commitments and ratepayer protections should be clear before construction begins. The grid can serve it and Oklahoma families will not subsidize it are two entirely different promises. A smelter cannot produce aluminum without a steady supply of alumina, and Oklahoma does not have a local supply of bauxite that would make this facility self-contained. That means large quantities of industrial raw material would need to be transported into northeastern Oklahoma. The exact supplier, transportation routes, and anticipated freight volumes have not been fully established in the publicly available information reviewed for this article. Those details matter. Depending on the supply chain, alumina and other materials could move through some combination of international shipping, inland waterways, rail lines, and local roads. Residents deserve to know how many barges would be required, how many rail shipments would arrive, and how many trucks would travel through the area each day. They deserve to know what additional activity would occur along the Verdigris River and the regional waterway system, what happens if material is spilled or released as dust, and who pays for road repairs, port improvements, or transportation infrastructure. The promise of domestic aluminum production should not obscure the fact that this project would still depend on a substantial outside supply chain. Calling the finished product American-made does not make the imported inputs, freight traffic, and infrastructure demands disappear. Primary aluminum production can generate several forms of air pollution, including particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, hazardous air pollutants, and fluoride compounds. The precise emissions from the proposed Inola facility remain subject to regulatory review and public dispute, but information cited in Attorney General Gentner Drummond's court filings provides a picture of the scale under discussion. According to the Attorney General's office, projected annual emissions identified in the application include approximately 87,182 tons of carbon monoxide, 731 tons of particulate matter, 425 tons of fluoride compounds, 316 tons of nitrogen oxides, 217 tons of volatile organic compounds, and 187 tons of hazardous air pollutants. Those emission figures come from the Attorney General's litigation materials. They are not final findings by a court or a completed environmental permit. The companies dispute suggestions that the facility cannot operate safely and say they intend to meet applicable environmental standards. That does not make the questions go away. Inola calls itself the hay capital of the world, which makes fluoride emissions especially relevant. Federal environmental guidance has long recognized that fluoride emissions from aluminum production can damage vegetation and create risks for grazing livestock when fluoride accumulates in forage. For a community surrounded by hay production, cattle operations, homes, and schools, residents have every reason to ask how emissions would be monitored, controlled, and enforced. Century Aluminum says the proposed Oklahoma facility would use modern technology and incorporate lessons learned from older smelters. That may prove true, but its operating history deserves examination before Oklahoma accepts assurances that new technology eliminates the risk. Residents also have reason to ask what happens when pollution control equipment fails. A promise to follow environmental regulations is not the same as a guarantee that equipment will never fail. Oklahoma should require independent air and water monitoring, public access to the results, enforceable cleanup guarantees, and a clear process for nearby property owners, farmers, and livestock producers to recover damages. The Frontier reported that residents near Century's South Carolina smelter filed a lawsuit alleging that emissions and equipment failures caused dust and health problems in surrounding neighborhoods. Century denied the allegations but agreed to pay more than $940,000 to settle claims involving 719 property owners. South Carolina regulators also fined the company more than $360,000 over air pollution violations and reporting failures. In Kentucky, the Frontier reported that Century facilities accumulated roughly 30 environmental violations over 12 years, involving emissions, hazardous waste, monitoring, emergency planning, and water quality. The company says previous problems have been addressed and newer technology would reduce the likelihood of similar incidents. The follow-up remains. If pollution control systems fail in Inola, who pays for the consequences? Supporters argue that expanding American aluminum production is important for national security. There is a legitimate case for maintaining access to aluminum used in aircraft, defense equipment, vehicles, electrical infrastructure, and other essential industries. But the national security argument becomes less straightforward when the country's largest aluminum supplier is Canada. Canada is an ally, a major trading partner, and part of an integrated North American industrial economy. Its producers benefit from low-cost hydroelectric power, while American companies increasingly specialize in downstream manufacturing and recycling. Recycling aluminum requires only about 5% of the energy used for primary production. A serious strategy should compare expanded recycling, keeping more scrap at home, stronger Canadian supply agreements, strategic reserves, and limited domestic primary capacity where the economics and safeguards make sense. The current approach relies heavily on tariffs, public subsidies, and the hope that Oklahoma can provide the cheap electricity required to make the project competitive. There is also an ownership question. The project's majority owner, Emirates Global Aluminium, is based in the United Arab Emirates. That does not automatically make the project improper. Foreign investment supports many legitimate American businesses. But if the argument is that the United States must reduce dependence on foreign interests for national security reasons, policymakers should explain how a facility majority owned by a foreign company answers every concern they claim to be addressing. The aluminum would be produced in Oklahoma. Control of the majority ownership would not be. The Inola smelter has become a significant issue in Oklahoma's Republican gubernatorial runoff. Attorney General Gentner Drummond has asked a federal court to block construction while his lawsuit proceeds. He argues that the project poses unacceptable risks to nearby residents, agriculture, and natural resources. His opponent, Mike Motzi, supports the project after receiving the president's endorsement. Reuters reported that Motzi had previously opposed the smelter before changing his position. The question is not whether manufacturing jobs are desirable. Of course they are. The question is whether Oklahoma should accept any industrial project merely because someone labels it economic development. A state can support manufacturing and still insist on safeguards, protect electric customers, and compare lower-cost alternatives. Before construction proceeds, Oklahomans deserve a complete and independent review of the project's environmental impact. They deserve public disclosure of the anticipated power demand and the terms that would protect other electricity customers. They deserve a transportation plan identifying expected truck, rail, and barge traffic. They deserve a complete accounting of federal subsidies, state incentives, tax exemptions, infrastructure costs, and discounted electricity arrangements. They deserve enforceable financial guarantees covering pollution, equipment failures, cleanup, and harm to nearby property or agricultural operations. Manufacturing can be valuable. Good-paying jobs matter. National security matters. But so do Oklahoma families, farms, electricity customers, and taxpayers. The aluminum may be stamped "Made in America." The pollution, power demand, and public subsidy will be made in Oklahoma.